Wait. Test. Gosh, there's no speakers.
No, this one doesn't speak.
Oh, this one has speakers?
Yeah.
Put this on. Someone. Like that.
Hello.
Yeah, around there.
Hello.
Record. Yeah. Talk.
Hello. How are we today?
Stop. Go.
Oh, we're getting that. No.
Okay.
Can you untangle this? I'm gonna use this. Should I give them the mic?
Yeah.
First, I'll give them the mic. Yes, please. Without one. And without one. Put on video mode.
Oh, yes.
Good.
So you guys, keep a natural view.
Wait, is this focused on the
You
show?
want to just look at Adler, that was right.
Wait. I want to see if the face. Yeah, it comes up.
This one, when you guys are talking, it'll pop to these kind of cycles. It'll be close up. And then when you guys are just talking amongst each other, instead of going to this one, that's going to be both of you guys together.
So we kind of just look like we're having
Yes, Adil, if you want to introduce things, look at this, look at your camera. So that was your camera. This is Bert. This is Dr. Smith's camera. Yeah?
Yeah, I can pretend there's an audience.
Yeah.
No, I'm trying to set it up first. Then I'll reflect on it.
it's impressive.
We've got the whole lens not big and stuff. Because the angle
Is it the tripod?
What do you?
Yeah, it's filtered.
Oh, is it tilted?
Yeah,
Okay.
I would. Do you have
Put it down.
that turn? I don't know how this one works. Usually there's something that you can turn.
What is it?
What's
Yeah, this,
What's one of these ones?
that should be out of view of the camera, right?
Which way?
it has to be like this.
Doesn't the spirit level show you?
Yeah, it does.
Tilted like this.
Left.
Okay, that's no one's gonna notice that's fine.
It's not centered as well. So
Yeah.
Is it the body?
Like the camera's pointing forward. I would.
I don't know.
Is it? I think it's a
Do you want
tripod.
to fix it?
Yeah.
Yeah, fix it.
Is it okay?
Yeah, on top, right?
I think it's.
I would turn it.
Yeah. I think I'll turn it a little bit.
That's exactly the table. Not a showing up.
The table's not showing up.
Yeah, that's exactly that. You can just see the top part of that. Okay, let's see just
Do you want to move it back?
I think the setup's fine, by the way.
This is fine.
Someone like go on the live and think it's. Is that over? Is it already on?
It says stream starting. We should start soon. Guys, I think that's actually
They don't.
that's good.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just said it's distracting. We're pretty straightforward. So I'll be pretty casual. Oh, yeah. So let's, Is you okay with me just asking about certain IR and stuff like that? I mean, even if you don't want to answer, we can move on.
Just anything that comes to mind. It's fine, just keep it casual.
So feel free to go in at the start.
Yeah, but we need to, how do we keep track of time?
To be honest, I can manage that. Yeah, I can manage that.
It's always...
I can manage the live comments on my phone. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind seeing the live comments and just... Is it my phone?
I think it's better if I send it to you because it's going to disrupt.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
If it's not on
Just make sure you have more questions than you need. Because if you run out of time, it should be fine. So it's 1 hour and 30 minutes. It's Q&A.
live? Okay, if you just can. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. All of us who are here in person and all of us who are joining on the stream online. It's wonderful to actually host an event, at least partially in person after such a long time in lockdown. And it's really good to be back with MYA. So tonight the event is titled The Environmental Emergency, the Need for an Islamic Response. So really we're looking at what is perhaps the biggest problem, or one of the biggest problems in the modern world. Perhaps the best argument against the modern world and the modern way of life is what human beings are doing to the environment. And we can look at deforestation, we can look at waste, we can look at pollution on land or sea or in the air, or we can look at extinction of species, or of course we can look at climate change and what's happening. On a variety of levels, there seems to be something wrong with the way we as humans are treating the world around us. And we're starting to feel the effect. Even in Australia, recently we've seen bushfires, the smoke, the recent droughts. Perhaps these are portents of what perhaps may come. So tonight we're going to explore these issues. What are the roots of these environmental issues? Like why they're happening? Is it capitalism? Is it technology? Is it science? What's at the root of these issues? And then as Muslims, what does Islam view in the environment? What role might Islam play? Can Islam perhaps be integral to a solution for humanity to move forward? And of course, as individuals, what can we do? What should we be pushing for change? So to look at that and a few other questions is what we'll be exploring tonight. To do that, we have someone who's very fit for the role. We have Dr. Samir Mahmoud, who is very well studied in the traditional sciences, but also has a deep, vast knowledge of the world, as anyone who's heard him speak has seen. So rather than me listing out all the degrees and stuff he's done, I thought I'd just start off letting him introduce himself a bit, because this is the first time he's talking publicly for MYA. So Doctor, maybe just tell us a bit about, because you obviously started here in Sydney, born and bred, and you went all around the world. Maybe just share briefly your journey, why, where you went, and sort of what you're working on at the moment, in a few minutes.
Inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin Muhammad ibn Abdullah afdal salatu wa taslim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Thank you for attending, both the live and the online. My name is Samir Mahmoud, born and raised in Sydney, Australia, in the eastern suburbs. At a very young age, my parents decided to send me back to Lebanon, move back to Lebanon after the Lebanese Civil War. They are Lebanese background. And it's there in the crucial years of my teen upbringing that I acquired a lot of the classical, traditional training with Jewel in Lebanon. And then during that period, I also did a diploma in economics at an American university in Lebanon. Moved back to Australia to attend the UNSW, where I did anthropology and politics, and spent some time doing my field work in the South Pacific, studying a particular community on island, remote island. And then pursuing after that a research degree and then an MA in architectural history, looking mainly at the traditional townscape. And what I mean by that is, why is it that we find the traditional cities and towns of the Islamic world and the world at large much more healing, much more soothing, much more soulful than many of the modern urban environments produced by modern world and modern technology. And that got me on a long intellectual journey in which I explored a lot of the philosophical, cultural changes and shifts that gave birth to the modern world, and which were then exported and uncritically internalized in the Islamic world. And then we ended up producing some of the ugliest cities in the world today. After that, I spent a significant amount of time traveling around Italy, the books in the trunk of the car, traveling around, exploring, studying psychology and some aspects of comparative philosophy and thought. And then I ended up at Cambridge with a scholarship degree, a PhD, a master's first in Islamic studies, and then a PhD in Islamic studies at the Faculty of Divinity. And during that period, I would spend a lot of my summers and time with traditional scholars in Lebanon and other parts of the world, looking at and studying certain kind of texts, especially some of Ghazali's texts and some of the other literature. And then eventually I ended up teaching in Lebanon as an assistant professor, and then came back to Australia to do a lot more community, the kind of work that I'm doing these days. Currently I'm a lecturer at the Cambridge Muslim College online, and also an academic director at Usul Academy, which is a new initiative that has been launched recently, where we combine the traditional Ottoman curriculum with the best of contemporary social sciences and humanities subjects. An online virtual madrasa.
There's a lot I could ask about, but for the sake of time, I think we'll get on to the topic for tonight. So if any of the audience has questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and then I believe they'll come to me. We'll probably get the questions towards the back end, inshallah. So just to start us off, before we get into like the roots of the modern crisis, I'd like to just ask, what is Islam's, what are some general ideas that Islam has or perspectives on the environment? Because I mean, we know we should treat animals well, plant trees, but on a sort of a deeper level, what are some broad sort of things to keep in mind to sort of frame this conversation?
Well, I mean, look, the important thing about the question of the environment is, you know, when the term deep ecology was first termed in the 60s, it was coined in the 60s, it referred to the study not just of the environment, but something called deep ecology. Deep ecology suggests the idea that human beings, as human beings, we are embedded within a very deep ecological system. That we're part and parcel of as living organisms. We're not separate from it. In fact, if anything, human beings are living beings, and so is the ecosystem. From an Islamic perspective, I would go deeper and say Islam offers a deep ecology. If one were to coin the term, I don't think it'll take off or catch on. But if you look at the Quran, it's a unique revelation in comparison with many of the other world's sacred texts. Insofar as it refers to nature, the extent to which it refers to nature is quite mind-boggling. I think the Taoist tradition in China is the only tradition that perhaps comes close to the kind of the degree or the extent of references about nature. So, at the heart of the, let's say, Al-Kitab al-Tadwini, the written revelation of the Quran, because in Islamic tradition, of course, in classical Islamic cosmology, the whole universe is Al-Kitab Tadwini. It's a written text like the Quran, except it is a Tadwini, which means it has come forth through act of creation. And it is written in a script that's not a human language, that's written in a cosmic script, divine language. All things come to be. So in the classical Islamic understanding, the whole cosmos is very much alive as the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the words of God. If we look at the Kitab al-Tadwini, the written revelation of the Quran, the number of references to nature is just, mind-blowing, right? It's overwhelming, which suggests that the natural world around us is at the heart of an Islamic understanding of reality. But it's important to bear in mind that when we refer to the natural world from an Islamic perspective, we don't necessarily just mean the physical world around us. Right? One of the fundamental problems, and we're going to come to this a little bit later, one of the fundamental problems at the heart of the modern worldview is its reduction. So if the modern perspective looks at the natural world as just this physical world of trees and plants and minerals around us, the natural world, alam al-tabi'ah, which is the term often used to refer to the environment or the natural world, in Arabic refers to the entire manifest world, right? Which is infinitely greater or infinitely vaster than just the purely physical realm that we see around us. And in its classical Islamic understanding, the physical world is part and parcel of a complex, multi-layered reality. Right? So when we talk about reality, in Arabic, we're not referring to the reality of the physical. We're referring to a complex, multi-layered reality. And the physical world being just one aspect. And if to even discuss it further, the physical world is a manifestation of these other levels of reality. Right? So the physical world then becomes what? It becomes the last trace of a chain of causation, linking the physical world to realms in the unseen. Exactly. So, if we were to discuss, for example, we tend to explain things in terms of causality. So, in the physical world, we tend to talk about causality. Causality in the physical world is a horizontal process. A causes B. There is such a thing also as vertical causality, which means the causal relationship between each level of reality itself. So if our laws of physics, if our laws that we use to discover the principles of order, pattern of the created world, manifest the physical world around us, we call causality. There is a vertical causality that helps explain how the physical world is related to other worlds. For example, in Islamic cosmology, the physical world is a manifestation of all of creation is a manifestation of divine. And so at the very pinnacle What that means is, why? Because we know from the definition and his kindness towards animals and living creatures that they have a haqq that is owed to them. And so if we transgress the limit and boundaries of kindness, even when we slaughter an animal, we have to abide by the utmost degree of compassion and kindness towards creatures. Otherwise, we cannot slaughter creatures. And so everything has a haqq, and that means that we're part and parcel of a living organism surrounding us. If that is the case, and if they are all manifestations of divine attributes and actions, that gives us no right to transgress the limits, right? Which means that a traditional civilization like Islam, with this intricate understanding of the nature of the fabric of reality, of which the physical world is merely one manifestation, cannot transgress against it. Only in a world, and we'll come to this a little bit later, in a world that is no longer sacred, that is no longer perceived as manifestations or traces of divine names and actions, in a world where things are seen purely as quantitative objects, that tree is just a chemical composition, people are hunks of matter, that's it. Only in a world where we've reduced reality to just this, can we then see them as objects of quantitative exploitation.
Now, I just want to touch on that. So there's these very interesting traditions that we have about like pebbles, and it seems like certain Sahaba and Prophet Sallallahu was able to see their or hear their tasbih. So it's almost like they can perceive these other levels of reality. And we also have a narration about a tree who which sort of seemed to have like gained consciousness in a sense. We also have a narration about a camel who would come to the Prophet and sort of complain to him. So these sort of touched on what you're talking about, but it sounds like we have these different levels of reality, and perhaps some people it's there, but it's not available to us all the time, or maybe it's to some people.
Absolutely. I mean, given that the fact that these are living entities and living realities, and given that the fact that the prophets, Sulaiman alayhi salam communicated with ants and all sorts of creatures. You mentioned the camel that ran amok in a marketplace when the Prophet ﷺ came. He complained to him that its owner had overburdened it, right? The palm tree that wept when the Prophet ﷺ, and he calmed it down by putting his hand on the mountain Uhud that murmured beneath his feet. And all sorts of, even, if you look at the fundamental role of animals in the preservation of the prophetic mission, like the spider that weaves that spider web, the cave, right? Where does he receive his first revelation? In a cave, right? In a cave. This is really, really important. It's very telling. A spider web, the birds that lay the eggs, right? All these aspects of how creatures intervene in order to protect the prophetic mission. Yes, the Prophet ﷺ, possessing the ability to, often said he was able to see with two eyes, right? One eye into the seen world and one eye into the unseen world. Now, although these are unique qualities of the Prophet ﷺ, these are capacities of the heart of a mu'min or pious mu'min, and it's something that is something that Muslims or pious individuals can develop through the faculty of the heart, which hence the reason why the faculty of the heart is so important in the Islamic tradition. We are often oblivious to this, and catastrophically so in the modern world, because many Muslims, unfortunately, though we are Muslims, we call ourselves Muslims, and though our intentions are pure and good more often than not, the unfortunate situation is because we are a product of a very secular, very scientific or scientist, reductionist worldview, we have lost the capacity to access perceptions in these realms. We're no longer able to do so, and it's not something that's not recoverable. It is recoverable. It is something we can do, and perhaps we can talk about this at some point. But it is something we urgently need to turn our attention to, because as Muslims, we have succumbed to this kind of tempting idea that all we really need is more science and more technology, and then we can play catch up, right? The fundamental error in this, the fundamental assumption that's mistaken here is that the narrow scientific paradigm that reduces reality to just a physical world and reduces our understanding of this physical world to just the senses and reason, this false assumption is something that now most Muslims share. And this is what's fundamentally problematic at the heart of the modern world, the modern paradigm. And the Muslim major contribution that we can play really is to restore the possibility of other faculties within us, other faculties of knowledge, and thereby open up access to other realms of reality.
So I sort of wanted to get at this question of what is the root cause. Obviously, you've already touched on what it might be, because people like to say, look, the problem is capitalism, like we have to stop economic growth. Other people say, look, we just need more green growth. We need new technology, stop using coal and everything will be all right. But you seem to be saying that it's not an issue on that level, it's more fundamental. It's how we view the world.
Yeah,
right? So
absolutely.
can you just speak more to that? Like how did this sort of worldview originate? At what time has it, and how has it sort of affected modern day Muslims? Because one thing I notice a lot is, to be honest, like when it comes to environmental issues, Muslims are usually in the back. You know, there's an interesting, Prince Charles gave a very nice speech on Islam and the environment, very profound. And you know, obviously he's not Muslim, but he's looking into Islam in a way where he's seeing these things. And you see, you know, the forefront of the environmental movement seems to be more in America and Europe, and it's not so much the case for Muslims. So what sort of happened, if you can just,
Well, essentially, you're right. The problems that the world faces today are not economic. They're not necessarily political. Although these are fundamental issues, they're symptoms of something much deeper. And that deeper issue is the birth of a particular set of values and philosophical assumptions a few centuries ago in Europe that has now become the global norm. It's become normative everywhere. 200 years ago, 300 years ago in Europe, you get the birth of scientism. Scientism is the idea, or the, let's say, I would say the ideology that the only reality that exists is the physical world, the physical level of reality. And the only reliable means of accessing this level of reality, or let's say this level of truth, is the senses, the human senses, and human reason. And so this is very reductionist in the sense that from a classical Islamic perspective, of course, it reduces the infinite, complex, multi-layered nature of reality to its least significant level, right? The sensible world, the physical world. And then it eliminates all the human faculties of possible knowledge, except the senses, and to a certain extent, aql, reason. This extremely impoverishes both the nature of reality and our ability to access it. This became the norm in many of the emerging secular philosophies, starting with Francis Bacon with his inductive method, then with Hobbes with his kind of scientific deductive method, then with Descartes with his method of radical doubt, and this, empirical rationalist traditions end up becoming the norm, driving a lot of the scientific paradigms of the 17th, 18th century, and the Enlightenment assumptions, Enlightenment in 18th century Europe. Now, if it had just remained a European phenomenon, it's not a problem, not an issue. But the technological development that accompanied the intense concentration of capital with the Industrial Revolution meant that it gave Europe a military edge over other parts of the world. Now, if it's interesting enough, and this I think is an important thing to point out, that at the turning point, or the moment at which the West dominated the rest of the world, it wasn't a moment yet where the West was more advanced philosophically, or advanced socially speaking, in terms of social justice, or in terms of equity, or in terms of level of education. It happened quite early on, purely as a result of a tip in military technology. And because if you look at the moment the English entered into India, the GDP of India and Mughal Empire was 15, 16 times larger than that of England. They sacked the Bay of Bengal. Trillions of dollars in today's terms, right? Wealth was transferred to Europe at the time, and the only superiority Europe had was purely technological, military, right? Now, this shock to the Islamic system meant that many of the Muslim empires at the time, like the Ottoman by the 19th century, were scrambling to catch up with the military advances of Europe. And they misdiagnosed the nature of modernity itself by suggesting that we really need to catch up with Europe, so let's just do what Europeans are doing. They didn't really critically evaluate and assess the philosophical assumptions behind the scientific paradigm, or this reductive paradigm. And because a lot of the change and shifts were happening from the top down, so it wasn't directly involving the intellectual classes and the ulama, but it was decision makers at the level of the administrators who wanted to quickly develop the military and the economy to catch up with the European powers, meant that a lot was expedited and adopted that was not, would not have otherwise been the case.
Yes.
And what added to that catastrophic, uncritical adoption of many of these assumptions was that many scholars at the time thought that one could just harmlessly adopt European technology and science, and we can continue doing our prayers in the same way, there's not a problem, and it would have no effect. What they didn't realize at the time, and perhaps were not entirely equipped to realize, was that by adopting the scientific method, they were adopting all the cultural values that came with it, all the philosophical assumptions that came with it. Even some of the greatest luminaries of the Islamic tradition in the late 19th, early 20th century fell into this trap. Not because of malice, not because of necessarily lack of intelligence, but it's, I would say, a sinister aspect of these kind of worldview that required very in-depth analysis and understanding. And this wasn't available to many Muslims until Muslims began thoroughly studying Western philosophy and Western thought and Western science in the 20th century and realized, hang on a minute, there are so many assumptions underlying this scientific enterprise that are just simply false. And now it's only now that Muslims are beginning to recover an entirely different kind of perspective on the issue.
Yeah, I just want to tease out something there. So like this sort of scientific worldview that comes out, like what is it about it that leads to these this sort of environmental destruction? Is it that now you no longer see it as sacred or meaningful, so you do certain things you wouldn't? Or is it more like it leads to technologies which allow you to do things which are destructive? So
okay, so there are a number of things that happened. Number one, in terms of the scientific paradigm, there's a reduction of the world, or disenchantment of the world, as they call it, which means that the world is no longer sacred.
Right.
The world is no longer a series of traces of the divine activity in the cosmos. And the bizarre thing is that if you look at the arguments of Francis Bacon and Thomas Hobbes and those empiricists who made these arguments against God, none of them make any sense from a philosophical perspective. Their assumptions and biases that they had that were then taken for granted simply because they had already addressed the existing doubts among a growing number of intellectuals in Europe. They're not sound arguments at all. Right? But in any case, they reduced world to nothing but a hunk of matter.
Yep.
They reduced all creation to just mechanical causality, especially with Hobbes and then Newton. And then they reduced the human being's ability to access these to just rational empirical observation. What that does is it reduces alam al-tabi'a, and in Arabic the word tabi'a is etymologically linked to the word taba and taba'a, which means to leave an imprint. So the world of nature in Arabic literally means the world that has the imprint of the imprinter, who is God, right? It doesn't necessarily mean the same in other languages. So the world is reduced to not even an imprint, because an imprint presupposes an imprint, right? Someone who leaves the imprint. It's reduced to nothing but just the physical things that you see around you. And that strips it of its deep existential depth, right? A tree is not just a tree.
Yeah.
If I describe a tree in a purely physical terms, all I can truly say is I've described the tree in purely physical terms. It doesn't logically follow that therefore that is all that the tree is. Yeah? That's the philosophical problem that happened, is that it reduced the isness of something, its reality, its existential reality, to what was purely, what was possibly what was physically possible or possible to describe physically, right? In physical terms. Sorry. So that, in terms of science, that happened. In terms of philosophy, the reduction of the human being to just a rational creature who's able to access the world through empirical observation and purely rational thought, right? In terms of the greater social transformations that are happening at the time, it's extending these scientific or scientistic paradigms into the social domain that was extremely catastrophic. So, for example, no longer was the social order now based on a set of moral, ethical principles rooted in some kind of transcendental realm. Because now when you extend this reductive analysis of the physical world into the social domain, and the moral domain, what you end up happening is, what is morality? Is it rooted in revelation? We don't believe in revelation anymore. We don't believe in God. Is it rooted in Platonic principles or some kind of Platonic Aristotelian notion of virtue? That's too transcendental. What is it rooted in? Utilitarianism.
Right.
We adopt certain moral values because of their social utility.
Which is like, it's just about pain and pleasure, right? Just maximize
pain and pleasure, what maximizes pleasure, what minimizes pain. It has its variants, but that became a dominant sense of moral philosophy. And what increases human pleasure is economic flourishing and activity, increasing human desires. So now the nafs, the lower nafs, becomes the measure of what? Of measuring happiness, measuring what is right and what is wrong. And it becomes the motivating drive behind a lot of social policy. So if traditionally speaking, in a classical Islamic civilization, the spiritual order reigned supreme on top, and beneath that, the moral, ethical, spiritual principles of the spiritual order governed the political economic activity, or political social activity, which governed then the activity of economic activity. In the new world in which the infinite accumulation of wealth for the gratification of human desire based on the utilitarian principle of self-interest, etc., means that now this new utilitarian logic becomes, and the economic logic of accumulation of wealth becomes the sole determinant and the driving force in society. And so instead of having spiritual moral principles, then political social order, and then the economic order, you now have the logic of the economy and capitalism, hence capitalism, trumping and governing in many instances social and political policy, and at the bottom of that, moral principles. So for example, many of our moral principles today are driven by the logic of the primacy of economic activity, right? Or economic benefit. And we saw this in the debate over COVID. Our economic system is so driven by the sense of perpetual growth, no longer by a sense of moral order, that anything that hinders economic growth means diminishment of wealth, which means it's bad. Even though the logic of perpetual economic growth is detrimental to the environment. Right? The environment now takes a step back because it's subservient to the logic of economic growth and economic order and economic wealth. Right? That's why we can't escape the problem of the environment today and the issues, because in many instances it affects economic growth and economic policy. How can we return to a way of life in which the balance with the natural order and natural environment was the norm? In previous economic systems, economic activity was not at the expense of this balance with the natural order. And people say, oh, but because we didn't possess the kind of technology we have today, or we didn't possess the kind of technology in which we can abuse and exploit nature today. And if they had them in the past, they would have done so. I don't think that's the case at all.
That's a common argument.
This kind of technology will not have even been possible in a traditional order in which the idea of developing a technology that bulldozes an entire mountain for the sake of economic exploitation is impossible. It wouldn't have been possible. I'm not saying that there weren't bad people in the past. I'm not saying there wasn't economic activity in the past that was detrimental to the environment. But the atom bomb is not just a result of technological progress. It's also the result of a fundamental separation of the ethical moral question from the development of technology and economic activity. They're completely segregated and separated.
So
today we consider it a great progress that we've separated the moral ethical question from scientific advancement.
So this idea that you can say, oh, technology is neutral, we can just take it and use it for how we want. It's just
not neutral at all.
Absolutely.
It is value laden,
Absolutely.
and it's extremely deeply ideological. Right? There's nothing neutral about it at all. And this is the error that the early Muslim scholars assumed about. Well, let's just industrialize Egypt and we'll be as powerful as England. Well, in the process, you're losing your soul.
Yeah. So
right?
When we copy what they've done, it comes with a lot more than just more stuff. There's a whole
absolutely. And so a radical thinking is required today. Muslims need to rise up to the challenge of radical thinking. So progress in the Islamic world cannot be, let's get to the level of economic wealth and prosperity and consumption that the United States have. The only reason why the US can still consume as much as it does is because the rest of the world is poor. If the world had the same level of consumption as the United States, we would have exhausted our natural resources by now already. Right? That's a terrifying, catastrophic idea, if you think about it. Which means, no, this is not feasible, it's not sustainable. And so it's not a question of let's turn Bangladesh into the next South Korea or United States.
Right.
No, it's a question of we need to find a radical alternative. Right? And a different economic order, a different kind of social, political order that's based on a radical rethinking of these fundamental assumptions.
Really interesting, and I want to get to that shortly, but I just want to flesh out these ideas about how things have changed. So we've got this different view of reality. Before we had layers, we have the heart, we have all these layers. It's been stripped down just to this physical, material kind of way of looking at things. And then also we lose the moral system of how things are, and you just have pain and pleasure. Right? So I just want to, by the way of an example, let's just take this cup, right? We have water, right? So what might be a tradition, because from a scientific perspective, what is water? You might say, oh, it's just H2O or whatever. But what might be a traditional way of looking at water? What would somebody
Well, I mean, look,
sorry, because I say that because you have in the Quran, if I'm not mistaken, you have rain as rahmah, or this is a traditional idea.
Yeah.
It's very different,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, okay, so the description of water as H2O is a quantitative description, right? It's talking about its physical composition. If we go back to the issue we raised earlier, is the physical composition of something the totality of what a thing is? The question is no. So what additional qualities are there that water possesses? The Prophet ﷺ used to say in a hadith that when it would start raining, he would step outside to feel the first drops of compassion drop on his face, right? Now, if you think about it, that's a really fascinating and really interesting description of his experience of what is otherwise we think is purely physical phenomenon. But it's not a physical phenomenon.
Right.
It's profoundly metaphysical. And today we might take it as a poetic description by the Prophet ﷺ. It's not poetic, it's literal.
That's the essence of it, right? And
that's the essence of it, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the essence of it, because the essence of something is not reducible to its physical appearance. So for example, let's use something more we can relate to, like a human being.
I was going to say that.
I may sit and dissect a corpse for years and discover every aspect of its physical composition and never see its essence. Right? You're sitting before me right now. What is your essence? A scientist would say, oh, okay, let's start dissecting you and we'll discover what you are. But the problem is that the whole is greater than the parts. Right? But the whole is more than just the physical parts also at the same time. In the Islamic tradition, of course, we believe that the essence of a human being is a unique essence granted to every creature by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by the inblowing of the Spirit. Even more radically so than this, we tend to, for example, think of the whole human species as humans, right? We're all human in this room, right? I haven't really said much, but in the Islamic tradition they would say, although we can refer to all human beings as human, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala relates to each one of us in our unique individuality, such that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turns his face towards each creature in the cosmos and gives that creature his full attention. Yani masala, each one of us in this room has Allah's face turned towards you. Yeah? You know, we know at the Day of Judgment, kullu shay'in halikun illa wajhu. Everything ceases to exist, right? Perishes except his face. He has a face turned towards you, and a face turns towards you, and a face turns toward you. And the moment he turns away, you cease to exist. To imagine this kind of, subhanAllah, this amazing, infinite, compassionate being who sustains your very existence by continually turning his full attention and face towards you. Right? Imagine when you walk into the room and you're talking to someone and someone turns their face towards you and they pay full attention to you. You feel nourished, right? I mean, this person's really paying attention to me. He knows me. He's you know. Imagine Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never ceases to look at you. Right? Never turns away to one creature and then misses another one. Every pebble, every molecule, every creature, every ant has a face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala turned towards it. And the moment the moment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ceases to look at you is the moment you cease to exist. Right? Now, and so your essence, therefore, is that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at. And that is what sustains you. Now, the question is, can any amount of physical analysis reveal any of that? Right? It simply can't. Now, the problem is, if you don't believe in any of this, and you're just convinced that the human being is just a hunk of matter, then your essence must be discoverable in that hunk of matter. Right? So this is where you get this fundamental problematic. And there are versions of this. There are different versions of this. Today, the latest version is neuroscience. Neuroscience says that by physically monitoring the activity of the brain, we can explain the brain. Right. Not the case at all. All you can truly say is, by physically monitoring the brain, we can understand the physical processes that underpin thinking. The physical process that underpin thinking. But thinking is not reducible to physical processes. There's an ideological assumption here that no one questions. And it's not based on any rational argument. Right? It's just an ideological assumption that's made, and we all assume.
The assumption is we can understand that. So the assumption is that we can understand the human being? Or?
Yeah, the assumption is, and I remember, I remember having a dinner in this wonderful English cottage house outside of Cambridge years ago with a friend of mine who's a neuroscientist, and he was Danish and he's married to an Italian. You know, the Italians quite passionate and they're fiery. Danish is quite calm and reserved, right? And he would say to, and we were getting into a conversation. I said to him, so what do you think love is then? He said, oh, love is just a chemical reaction in the brain. And I said, his wife walked into the room, the kitchen where we were sitting. And I said to him, can you say that again? He looked over his kitchen and said, no, I can't say it. I'm not going to say it. I said to him, but you get the point, right? In a very rational, abstract sense, sitting at the table with me, he can make that argument. But it's questionable whether he lives his entire life according to this. Yeah? On the contrary, the way he lives his life seems like he believes love is more than just a chemical reaction in the brain, right? And that's the thing about, it's the thing we discussed earlier. When people are having, let's say, conscious, rational arguments and conversations, they will spew out and say all sorts of different things to consciously defend the intellectual argument that they hold. Yeah. It doesn't mean that they live by these arguments. If you see them living the way they live, you'll see that they live by entirely different principles. Yeah? And so not everything someone says is something that actually defines who they are.
Right. This is because I really hope we're not getting too philosophical here, but I think this is really important. Like what you're saying is obviously these people, they don't live by it, but also there's this fundamental assumption about reality which is just wrong. Like, because this idea that there's an independent reality, this whole subject-object distinction, the idea that there's a reality independent of your own conscious experience is not really found on anything. Can you just speak to that?
Well, most philosophers of science don't believe in that anymore. Most actually scientists don't believe in it. There's enough evidence that the observer affects the way in which certain particles function and operate, and there is no such thing as a purely independent objective world that's independent of our own subjective reality and our own existence. But important to bear in mind something here, that before we get into that, this subject-object dichotomy and distinction is a very recent one. Right? It's born of a particular way of understanding the world. When the material world was reduced to just physical existence, this is where the idea of an objective world that exists independent of my existence, or a material world that's purely the realm of extension, right? So volume, size, shape, etc., motion. But okay, so this assumption that juxtaposes an external world as opposed to an internal world is also premised on the idea that, my internal world to a large extent is subjective, and therefore nothing I can generate, no knowledge I can generate internally can arrive at a certain degree of objectivity, any degree of objectivity, which is problematic. Why? Because, so for example, by the 18th century, in the Western tradition at least, reason was considered the only faculty that can access objective knowledge. Your emotions, your feelings, your intuition, your imagination, all these are purely subjective, to be relegated to the realm of art, the aesthetics, the realm of wishy-washy, tree-hugging feelings, right? Completely dismissed as means of accessing knowledge about the world. We now know, of course, that that's very naive. There's a lot of work in philosophy today, in contemporary thought, that's restoring all these other faculties as important modes of knowing the world, right? That fundamentally we're not the rational creatures we thought we were. Enough has been said by Freud and others to show that the human being is largely under the influence and compulsion of forces that are below the level of consciousness. Right? So if we're not rational creatures, then what are we? Right? The Islamic tradition has, for over 1,000 years, pointed out again and again that human beings are susceptible to the influences of the nafs, and that there are rigorous processes and criteria by which we should be able to purify the nafs and the soul in order to open up a path of knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is purified of the compulsions of the lower nafs and the compulsions of the world around us. Right? And this brings us to the idea of how we define the question of freedom. But what was the question you mentioned?
I just wanted to tease that out. Is that that of independent reality versus us being intrinsically tied within
so
reality?
We're not independent of the world around us. We're part and parcel of its very fabric. And so that's why in the classical Islamic tradition, for example, we're able to describe, let's say, when we said earlier that the divine names permeate existence, they permeate also the human beings and everything in creation. So Ar-Rahmah, for example, permeates mountains and trees, and it permeates me and you. So I'm already bound to the very fabric of reality by the fact that we share these traces of the divine names. We're made of the same stuff, as it were, which means I'm not independent of the world. If anything, classical scholars say one of the fundamental reasons why human beings are able to know things external to themselves is because we share the traces of the same divine names within us. Right? That very idea allows us to avoid the whole false subject-object dichotomy. It's an absurd dichotomy born of a very reductionist vision of the world. Right? And by virtue of knowing certain things within me, I can know certain things without me. So for example, how do you know, let's say I want to discover a deeper aspect of the cosmos, right? Okay, one way of doing it is a scientific method, by saying, okay, the only way you can truly know what a tree is to use your rational mind in empirical observation, dissect it into its chemical composition, and then therefore, voila, you have the essence of a tree, right? Well, that's one way of looking at things, and it's certainly the most superficial. It doesn't exhaust the reality of the tree. Okay, so what's another way of doing it? Well, okay, if I become more compassionate I see compassion in existence. The more I become, the more I'm able to see. Right? There's a very different epistemology here. It's not presupposed it doesn't presuppose purely a logical, rational process. It presupposes that the more I become, the more I access being. So, if the Quran tells us to become virtuous, to become more compassionate, there's a reason for this. It's because the more compassionate I become, the more I'm able to see the traces of the divine name Ar-Rahman in all of creation. The more I'm able to become virtuous, and this is where I think it's really important in the Islamic tradition, ethics and virtue are not an independent domain.
Right.
By virtue of becoming more virtuous and ethical, you're actually granted deeper access to reality.
Right. So
that's why the Prophet ﷺ was able to see with two eyes in the physical realm and the non-physical realm. Right? Access to the non-physical world presupposes virtue, presupposes polishing the heart, presupposes removing the obstacles of the lower nafs in order to open up the inner eye of perception, which is as objective in its ability to perceive the objectivity of the unseen world as the physical eye is able to objectively give me a witness statement that that tree outside actually exists. Right? So we have multiple faculties of knowledge which grant us access to multiple levels of reality or aspects of reality, and there are multiple methodologies to adopt. And why this is important is because some people often require, and you find this a lot among many atheists and many others, many people require purely rational answers to questions that are at a spiritual level, right, or at a physical level. For example, I can't ask the senses to give me rational testimony to anything, right? But I can ask them to give me a physical testimony to the fact that a tree exists, right? The mind requires rational argument and logic, but there are certain aspects of reality that have their own domain, their own faculty. So one would have to say that maybe intuition, the heart, and what I mean by intuition here is very important. When we say the heart, I don't want you to think that I'm talking about the physical heart necessarily. And I'm not talking about either the emotional heart, right? I'm talking about the heart as that faculty of inner perception within us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has endowed every human being with, that functions like an eye in its ability to pierce the veils of reality into the unseen.
Right.
Yeah? That's an independent faculty of knowledge. So when someone denies the heart, they're thereby denying the methodology or method by which I can verify certain things in the realm to which the heart gives access to.
Using the wrong tools to get to...
Exactly. Without this complex, multi-layered understanding of reality, there's too much intellectual confusion out there. So by definition, if a biologist works at the level of the physical world, a biologist cannot make any claims beyond a physical claim. And what's the most you can say at the physical level is, I'm describing a physical process. You can't therefore jump, it's an intellectual fallacy to say, therefore there is nothing else. There's no logical relationship between, And so this is what a lot of contemporary atheists fall into, a lot of the problems they fall into. Imam al-Ghazali used to say, for example, you can't expect. He says one of the problems that many people have on the spiritual path is you may admire a great mathematician for his intellectual genius, because the mathematician has mastered the ability to verify evidence, proof, and logical, putting them together into a logical proof, either deduction or induction, right? And therefore, when that same scientist or mathematician then makes a claim in a domain outside of mathematics, we tend to believe them, like Stephen Hawking, for example, or Richard Dawkins. Why? Because we assume that that same level of intellectual rigor that they used in their science is transferred over into this other domain of knowledge, and therefore they've arrived at a similar conclusion using a similar method. Right? Two problems with that. The first is you can't use the same tools in other domains of knowledge, number one. Number two, they haven't done that. They've made it an ideological leap. Right? And that's deeply problematic. And Imam al-Ghazali says quite brilliantly, he says, But people's trust in this mathematician is such that any statements or claims they make in other domains of knowledge carry the same aura of truth as the initial mathematical claim.
Which is what you see now, because people say, oh, he's a neuroscientist, so he can tell me everything about how reality works. You see it all the time.
Neuroscientists can't say much about any other than, I remember the same neuroscientist telling me, making this grand claim that's really sound absurd to me. He said, it's amazing how I can watch consciousness through my MRI scans on my computer. And I'm thinking, what? Why? Because the assumption here is that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. It's a byproduct of a physical process. And so if I can see the physical process, I'm seeing consciousness. Yeah. Consciousness is not reducible, right? Reductionism is a fundamental logical and philosophical fallacy that no one seems to notice.
There's a lot of big ideas we could keep talking about, but to sort of get back right onto the topic here, of course this is essential. So we have this sort of worldview, we have all these things happening that's led to the situation. And you talk about we need a radical rethinking of restructuring of how we're going to do things. We can't just copy what's been done. So I guess the way forward on two levels. So one, as individuals, I guess, what can we think about? Because you have things like, go and recycle and don't use plastic and eat well and all this kind of, permaculture and plant your garden and all this kind of stuff. And obviously, there's a place for that. But obviously, on a macro level, it seems like we need to change things fundamentally. So what should be our focus? Is the first thing philosophical, and then we can talk about different economic systems. So,
well, we need to go back to our roots. At Usul Academy, we have this motto. It's called Al-Tajdid Al-Mu'assal. Rooted revival. We need to go back to our roots because, and our roots lie in the Quran and in the Sunnah, and then in the remarkable way in which these two founts of knowledge poured into the very fabric of every Islamic discipline in Islamic civilization. Let's go back to our roots, and one way of doing so is to begin to re-explore how traditional Islamic sciences worked and operated. How did they see the world? Islamic scientists who work in the field of chemistry or alchemy are not precursors to the modern chemist.
Right.
They're not at all. Ibn al-Haytham, for example, who worked in optics, is not a precursor to modern optics. Ibn Sina is not a precursor to modern medicine. And I know many Muslims would like to say, Ibn Sina was the first, the great doctor. Yes, he was. But there's a qualitative difference between the kind of medicine he practiced and the kind of medicine and the medical field today. And we need to recover what that qualitative difference is. Because it's not just a quantitative difference. It's not like Ibn Sina was a doctor 1,000 years ago and we have doctors today. No, they belong to entirely different ways of looking at the entire world. And we need to recover that. And of course that requires that you guys in the audience, this young generation, goes back to reclaiming their roots and their intellectual heritage. And what I mean by reclaiming their roots and intellectual heritage, I mean not just going back to reading Quran and Sunnah and practicing their prayers. That's all very important. But you need to recover in what ways did the Quran and the Sunnah produce a flourishing medieval Islamic civilization with a variety of different intellectual disciplines like medicine, like philosophy, like ethics, like optics, like astronomy, etc. And what is so qualitatively different about the way in which they integrated this sacred vision of reality within their scientific practice. Because what they produce is not just an earlier version of what we have now. It's an entirely different version of it. And that's what we need to do. We need to recover, or we need to, let's say, be inspired. I'm not saying romantically, let's go back to a dead past. I'm saying the past or the tradition has so much to offer us today in enabling us to reconceive and rethink our way forward. In architectural history, we say to give the past a future. Because one of the fundamental errors of the 18th, 19th century in Europe, one of the fundamental principles of the Enlightenment was to entirely reject the past and assume we can start from scratch.
Right.
And in so doing, it rejected so much of the wisdom with it. unfortunately, many Muslims did the same. They adopted the same response, that all the works of, let's say, Ibn Sina and medicine are irrelevant in contemporary, because medicine has, okay, if you take medicine as purely just mechanical, measurable, quantifiable prescriptions or diagnosis, then yes, right? Maybe specific aspects of Ibn Sina's collected works have been proven wrong, or maybe we've moved beyond. But that's not what we need to recover. It's not the specific diagnosis of diseases. It's the way in which the whole idea of health was conceptualized, right? Traditional Islamic medicine wasn't based on working with sick people. It was fundamentally working with healthy people, preventing sickness. And dealing with the sick was one aspect of it. Traditional Islamic medicine was rooted in a holistic understanding of the human being, where health was a physical, spiritual, mental, emotional reality. They're not separated. It's no coincidence that Ibn Sina produced one of the greatest works in medicine that was taught all the way up to the late 19th century at Cambridge, by the way, still. And at the same time produced one of the greatest philosophical systems in the Islamic world, and produced treatises on love, treatises on all sorts of different spiritual things. He even produced a work on salat. Right? It's no coincidence that this holistic vision produced scholars that were experts in several fields, because this tawhidic perception and understanding meant that the fields were not separate. Each field of knowledge was just one way of looking at the same reality.
Okay, so I'm sort of getting a sense of, like, I guess we have to make that shift and sort of understand the world the way it should be understood, right? How do you see this sort of, maybe it's hard to answer, but how does this then translate to our treatment of the environment? Is it like, are we going to sort of turn away from certain economic systems and change things up? Like, is that a natural outcome of that?
It is, eventually. The problem is we don't know what this alternative radical system will look like.
Very hard to imagine.
Why? Because no one's doing it. That's the problem. We're too caught up in the same paradigm. Not enough young Muslim minds, and I'm looking at you in the audience, yes, and not enough young Muslim minds are dedicated themselves and their lives to these crucial projects. In parallel to that, of course, we have to minimize the amount of danger and minimize the amount of destruction to the environment. So yes, you have the permaculture traditions, and you have this kind of going minimalist and reducing your level of consumption. You have your, I'm not going to participate in this whole logic of consumerism, long hours of work. It's painful, it's a painful transition to live by. So in parallel to this kind of hopeful, in some future date, radical revival, in the meantime, we need to change our lifestyles radically. And there are ways of doing that within the constraints of the modern system.
But because there are some serious constraints, like you can do certain things in your
and
personal life.
We're going to have to live with them until a radical alternative is offered.
So this radical sort of rethinking or this project has to happen, and then we can hopefully be able to imagine even something.
Because the problem is so endemic and so systemic that
we can't even.
At the individual level, there's only so much you can do within our lifetime, right? I mean, realistically speaking, each one of us in our room has I have about 20, 30 years, if I live, until the expectancy date of, I can die today or tomorrow, right? Realistically speaking, within our own lifetime, this is probably not going to happen. But if we start building the foundations for the next generation to start radically rethink things, and it's an urgent thing, because since we started speaking about this topic an hour ago, 6 or 7 or 8 different species of creatures have died, have gone extinct, right? Can you imagine that? Living things, nations, have become extinct, have gone, probably beyond recovery. The biodiversity of the planet is diminishing at an exponential rate. So it is the most urgent thing. And what shocks me is, why am I always looking at what shocks me is why Muslims are not at the forefront of this global struggle and fight against the destruction of the environment. On campus, where are the Muslim environmental groups? I mean, your sacred text has more to say about the environment than any other book on the planet, right? creation is a cascade of divine manifestations of divine names. I mean, you can't get a more beautiful image than this. Yeah?
This is actually a question on that at the moment, which essentially asks, like, how do we create and encourage a moral sense of responsibility towards the environment, considering our bleak sort of understanding of it?
Part of going back to our roots.
Our roots, yeah.
I mean, if you go back to these roots of our tradition, all these things will become spontaneously part of a Muslim way of life and a Muslim way of looking at things.
Right.
The fact that we're not at the forefront of these issues means that there's something fundamentally problematic about our worldview and our lifestyle. Right? We're Muslims in part, and we're not Muslims in other parts. And that's the reality. And unless we confront that reality, we're schizophrenic beings who, within our own mind, several personalities occupy this subjective world of ours. They're often in conflict. We speak different voices. It's not entirely our fault. Many of these issues are not our fault. We didn't produce this as a Muslim community. We didn't produce this. But the question is, what are we doing about it? Yeah. What are we doing about it? And if we are going to be خَيْرَ أُمَّةٍ أُخْرِجَتْ لِلنَّاسِ, if we are going to be an ummah of shuhada, witnesses over the rest of humanity, if we are going to be the Muhammadan ummah that bears the compassion that is the essence of the Muhammadan message, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we need to rise. And if Islam is the last dispensation, then it contains within it the remedy to help heal the rest of the world. Right? The problems today are not Muslim problems, they're global problems. So we need an outward-looking perspective that embraces the issues confronting humanity and a confidence to address them from our own tradition and our own principles. I think one of the biggest barriers Muslims have today is with the rest of the world is precisely the fact that there are barriers. I think I've given this example before, and I'm going to give it again. Sure. It touches on the environmental issue, but it's more about the attitude. And I think I mentioned this example to you, Adil, about my colleagues, German colleagues in Granada, eating chicken at a restaurant, and I chose to eat vegetarian. And they inquired why, and I said, and I have philosophical, moral reasons why. And that piqued their interest, and they asked me, why, what are the reasons we're interested, Because, look, every human being, every decent human being in the world, and most people are decent, are genuinely concerned about moral, ethical considerations, right? So why not address this common humanity that we have with people? So I said, well, before I eat the meat, I really want to make sure that the creature was killed with minimal pain. That's an interesting thought. I want to eat. Make sure that the creature was treated right when it was alive. Make sure it wasn't in a cage all its life. It was fed well, probably happy and smiley at times. Oh wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, that's interesting. Never thought about that. I want to make sure that when the animal's killed, it wasn't killed in the presence of another animal. Animals have feelings. Because Prophet ﷺ once walking in Medina, I think it was Mecca or Medina, and he saw a man put his foot on the head of a sheep, and he said, "Are you going to kill the animal twice? I mean, it can see the blade. You've killed it once emotionally, and now you're going to slaughter it, right?" And they said, "Okay, that's fascinating." And so I said, "Then when I kill the animal, when I eat I want to make sure that the meat was, and I mean, it's a living thing. It's a living thing, and it's important to be in a state of compassion and invoke cosmic compassion." Oh, wow. I never heard of that before. And then I said, that's what we Muslims call halal meat. And the jaws dropped, right? If I had said, which is what most Muslims do, it's not halal, they would have thought, okay, this guy is different. It's an ethnic religious group that has a unique dietary requirement. Okay, they have their right to do so. I don't want them to recognize my right. I want them to recognize that is the right of the animal to be treated that way, right? I want them to recognize that this is an ethical, moral consideration that touches on our fitrah and our common humanity, right? A lot of our Sharia and a lot of our Quran, a lot of our principles are rooted in these fitraic principles that we share with humanity, right? We have to get out of this mindset that we're a minority with its own rights, right? This discourse of right troubles me. It really does. You know, I'm not going to go on a rant about, critical race theory or anything like that, or right discourse, but I think it makes us lose sight of the fundamental spiritual, ethical, moral substance of our Sharia. And that is, it is rooted in our global humanity. Right? In the Maturidi tradition, they call it al-asma al-adamiyya. Right? We can call it our fitra. Our laws are not like a lot of the Jewish dietary laws that are rooted in some past cultural practice. There's nothing cultural about our Sharia in the sense of its fundamental principles. Our maqasid, Sharia, the 5 ethical, objective, moral principles, were considered by most scholars as universal, right? In many ways. And so we have to reclaim this universal discourse that is rooted in ayyuhan nas, or humanity, which is what the Quranic discourse is always about, right? So reclaiming our roots immediately reconfigures us into the kind of beings who naturally start to look at the natural environment or the environment around us as signs and sacred. It's not necessarily a political program of action. I know a lot of you youth in the audience are very politically active and whatnot. It's not a blueprint for political action and revolution. It is a revolution, but it's a revolution that has to start in the heart and mind before it can, because when the heart and mind are transformed, automatically it generates different political, social, economic policies and activities and outlooks.
Okay, that's fascinating. I mean, one interesting thing, I guess on a practical level for us to sort of recover that, can you speak to, I guess, the role and the importance of people spending time in nature amongst these kind of signs? How does that work?
Well, I mean, look, first of all, left to our own devices, we love nature, right? Our fitrah is inclined towards nature. And the proof of that is when we go for a stroll in nature, we feel at peace. There isn't a single person in the world who won't agree to the following statement. In nature, I feel happy. In nature, I feel at peace. In nature, I feel myself. I feel like I'm myself. I'm at home, right? Now, this in of itself is an interesting argument for the fact that there is such a thing as a universality for our human nature. It goes against all the arguments that claim otherwise, right? There is a universality to our human nature. The second thing is, a lot of people will tell you that in tune with nature, living in nature, it's very difficult to become an atheist. Atheism is an urban phenomenon.
Right.
It really is. It's born in cities where people are kind of alienated from nature and overly exercise their cerebral capacities at the expense of their primordial fitraic connection to things. Right? Now, as Muslims, we should be the last creatures on the planet to be alienated from nature. Right. Because 5 times a day, we pray according to a time that's regulated by the movement of the sun. We fast every year by a time regulated by the movement of the moon. Right? We orient our body in a certain physical direction. We move, exercising our body and our mind and our heart in zikr. We perform ablutions using a natural substance called water. We cannot be alienated from nature if we are truly practicing the inner spiritual substance of our prayers. Right. That's why, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many scholars, although that phone is useful for determining the time of prayer, it should not be the only determinant for time of prayer. We should continually look out the window. That establishes that connection to the rhythms of the sun. And this bodily, spiritual, mental connection to the rhythm of the sun is something that recalibrates and reconfigures our inner reality. The rhythms of nature are nothing but the traces of the divine action in creation. Right. Why do you want to turn your back on God? When you turn your back on the sun, you're turning your back on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why? We're not saying that in any pantheistic sense that nature is God. No. But nature are the activities of the divine names, the sifat, and the divine actions. Right? And that's how we know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you look at that watch, I mean, you might as well be cooped up in a room with no windows then, right? But that's not the point of our existence. My dream is one day, before Ramadan, 1 billion or 2 billion Muslims stand on the rooftops, turn all of the electricity off, and greet the moon, right? Not in any pantheistic sense, of course, but to tasbih and zikr, you know?
Yeah, right.
Welcome Ramadan. And Muslims used to do this. There's a lot of zikr, there's a lot of salat, a lot of dua upon welcoming Ramadan. And what image would this send to the world? 2 billion people turning electricity off will probably save a lot of, you know, several electricity companies will probably go broke, which is fine. Probably save a lot of CO2, carbon emissions, right? But it's a wonderful image. It's born of a natural disposition to connect to the rhythms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in nature. Right? Sorry, I forgot the question.
No, we were just talking
It
about
tends to happen, sorry.
spending time in nature and like.
Yeah. So connection to nature, yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
is that something we should do actively? Because obviously we can go and say, okay, Asr has come in. Like I can look at my phone, but I can actually go and see like shadow length. It's a very different kind of.
It is a very different connection. And to confirm your, let's say, I mean, your bodily clock, you can look at the watch after. But it shouldn't be your first resort, you know. It's like you know, and you're looking at the seconds, and door time, Allahu Akbar, you know.
Well, apparently.
Well, like what happened to, you know, the whole, I mean, when you're performing wudu with water, right? Water is a mysterious substance that when it washes over your body, it not only washes your physical body, but with the correct state of mind, it washes away your inner reality, your inner being, your heart, your mind, your soul. And we know this, even an atheist knows this, you know. We pay millions of dollars for sea view apartments, right? We go to the beach. I mean, lockdown people were so angry because they couldn't go to the beach. Why? You go to the beach, you sit by the water, you hear the water, you see the water, it declutters you. It makes you peaceful, right? It sends you back to your fitrah. Many shuyukh say, look at the face of a person as they first emerge out of the water, and you'll see their fitrah face, right? Now, if you're washing yourself 5 times a day for wudu, I mean, how can you be so far from your fitrah? If that's the case, then there must be something wrong with doing. Right? Our salat become mechanical.
Right.
And Hadith of Prophet ﷺ, the most some people get out of their prayer is what? A good view of the wall or an exercise. Right? Yeah? Now, of course, in our age, it's difficult to maintain the kind of presence of hudur al-qalb that is, because there's so many distractions in the modern world, so many distractions, which is why the ulama say that in the later days, and this hadith about this, that if you can salvage 1/10 of your deen, you're achieving what the Sahaba achieved.
Right.
1/10 of your deen. And that says a lot about the kind of time and age that we live in. And so if we reconnect to the kind of the kind of sacred spirituality of the Quran itself, we won't be the type of Muslims who would reject a garden in an urban mosque today, for example. Or we won't be the kind of Muslims that celebrate the use of steel and iron and concrete in mosque architecture or house architecture. We'd be more inclined towards the use of natural material. Right? I'm an architectural historian in one of my practices, so it shocks me the extent to which Muslim cities are ugly. We're just so out of sync with our own fitrah and the natural world around us. And these are just manifestations of that kind of disequilibrium. Yeah,
I'm getting a couple of questions here. We're running out of time, but if you could just give them quick fire answers to this. So, in a world with animals being treated unjustly and treated as a commodity, is it better for Muslims to be vegetarian or semi-vegetarian?
That's a question that hinges on a fact that I can't answer. I don't know, which is to what extent are animals actually contributing to the environmental disaster? I don't know. I'm not that well versed in that. But the Islamic tradition does not prevent Muslims from becoming vegetarian if they want to. It just says that you can't ban eating meat for Muslims. You know, the had of the Sharia is that we can eat meat, and when we do, this is the had, that it's done this way. But it doesn't mean that you can, you know, you can't become vegetarian.
It has to be done right.
Yeah.
That's it.
And It has to be done right, yeah. But it doesn't mean you can't become a vegetarian.
Yeah, if you want.
But as a solution to environmental degradation, that would require that I know to what extent the animal industry is contributing to this.
I guess.
What I can say, I don't know to what extent it's contributing, but what I can say is, according to the strict criteria of halal, most of the way in which animals are slaughtered and killed out there is not halal. And I would say 80% of the halal industry is not halal. If I were to be really, really strict about it.
Technically, or in its true essence of what halal is meant to be, do you mean? Without getting to like a fiqh.
I'm not going to get into the fiqh of it, but I just wonder sometimes, you know. And certainly this business, I'm from Lebanon, so we see this a lot. Come Eid al-Adha, and then you've got like 50 sheep at the butcher in front of his shop, and they're slaughtering them one after the other in front of each other, and then the blood runs in the gutters. That's not halal. There's something fundamentally wrong here.
Yeah.
And any sound nature, any person with a sound fitrah will be disgusted by it, and rightly so, right? Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's all I can really say on that.
Okay, so we have an interesting question here. So Elon Musk, obviously he wants to go to Mars and establish a presence with his SpaceX. Maybe just comment on this. The question is, do you think it's possible and worth, and maybe you can talk about what that kind of even project sort of suggests.
I don't know, let him go. I don't know. Maybe rid the planet of all these kind of corporate giants. I don't know. I mean, is it worth it? Look, one of the things. I mean, one of the fundamental problems with this modern separation of ethics and morality, and it's separating into separate domains. You can spend $1 trillion on military technology, or a space project, and then in your street you have 50 million people who are poor. That suggests a fundamental flaw and a split, let's say a disease at the heart of society that's problematic. And from a Shari'i perspective, it doesn't make any sense at all, right? Nothing trumps the maqasid. People are starving and people are dying. Investing in an expedition to Mars, for example. Now, I know it's a private investment, but the very idea of people amassing so much wealth, Islamically speaking, is also mind-boggling. The traditional Islamic economic system has inbuilt mechanisms that prevent, because wealth is, to a certain extent, finite, and so if some people get richer because others are getting poorer, right? There's not an infinite amount of wealth or resources in that sense. So this kind of this accumulation of wealth at that level, to that extent, is deeply problematic. Yeah.
So I think we're running out of time, so we'll wrap up. Do you want to just say maybe some final words on what we should really, if you could summarize, what can we kind of take away from this? Maybe what we should really be focusing on going forward?
Wallahi, given the extent of the problems and crises that we're dealing with, I urge today's youth, especially university youth, to whatever path of knowledge they pursue, not to do so independent of a proper study of their usul, of their tradition. And I'm not just saying this because of personal pious reasons, it's good for you and your akhirah to do so, it is, absolutely. But because this ummah needs a profound intellectual recovery. Yeah, because if you look at the extent to which for example, the Arabian Gulf has adopted technology, or the extent to which Muslims pride themselves on producing large number of doctors and engineers, that pride in numbers of engineers and doctors suggests a very faulty way of thinking about things. We should be proud of producing the next generation of thinkers, ethical giants, not necessarily producing 1 million engineers and doctors every year. So I would urge students who are pursuing engineering or pursuing any degree at university, if you don't want to be, let's say, drawn into its values and its philosophical assumptions and get lost in it or influenced by it negatively, it's important to also simultaneously root yourself in some classical Islamic training. And what I mean by that, I don't just mean, to a session on reading hadith and a bit of extra fiqh, our Islamic intellectual Shari'i tradition extends way beyond that. Way beyond that. Yeah.
I think the theme of tonight seems to be we have to get back to the root of things, the essence of things, to really move forward in every way.
Absolutely. Because the world doesn't need more engineers and doctors. Well, that's important. I'm not downplaying it. What it needs is new ethical visionaries. At the peak of Islamic civilization in Baghdad, a lot of the doctors were Christians and Jews. They weren't Muslims necessarily. But what allowed Islamic civilization to flourish was its unique spiritual and ethical vision for humanity, in which it allowed other religious traditions to flourish, it allowed diversity to exist within certain parameters, and it allowed and cultivated the pursuit of knowledge, unhindered by political constraints. It offered a new ethical, spiritual vision for humanity. That's what we need radically today. Yeah? Because you can accumulate an infinite number of engineers and doctors, and they'll turn, any Muslim city into the next Tokyo or New York. What's the point?
What's the point? We have to do something a bit more
different, radically different.
So on that note, we'll end it there. Thank you very much for everyone who attended live and on the stream. We have a lot of things coming up with MY very shortly, especially in late November, early December, all sorts of things, different types of events, community stuff, sports events, story night, etc. So stay tuned. There'll be a lot more coming soon. Thank you very much again for attending, and Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.